couple of kids came up to me and they were shaking. They were going, "Best morning ever." To all the parents, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. Tonight, bedtime, you're going to be cursing me. But yeah, we had this idea from a wedding. I was at a wedding, they had a candy bar, and I've been to a couple like that, and I thought it was amazing. So I had to kind of twist some people's arms, but we got it implemented, and it's a good time. So enjoy the candy. I'm sorry for the crash you're going to suffer later. When I was 19 years old, a man from my church in Oakville sponsored me to go to a conference in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And so it was at a church/Bible college down there. So at 19 years old, having never gone on a plane, I flew to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Now a couple things, and I didn't know better at the time. The first thing is there was a transfer between planes in Atlanta, Georgia. I don't know if you've ever been to the Atlanta airport. It's like a small city. It's massive. I believe it's the biggest hub outside maybe Chicago and New York, but the biggest hub airport in the United States. And quite literally the trip, and I had to grab my luggage and go, the trip across this thing was like incredible. What they had are these escalator things like that move, and so you get on them and you walk twice as fast. It's a pretty cool feeling. But got on my transfer flight. Because I hadn't arranged anywhere to stay down there before the conference started. So I was going to fly there that night, and I had nowhere to stay. And the man who sponsored me, nice guy, but he said, well, maybe just sleep at the airport. So, okay, like I didn't know better. I was 19. So anyways, I was flying down. I was on the flight from Atlanta, Georgia to Baton Rouge, and a young man who was a soldier who was on furlough sat down beside me. And so being me, I started talking to him about God and shared with him, and I was witnessing to him about Christ. And God must have really had this guy's number, because the man in front of me got up, turned around, and witnessed with him too. So this guy had two people at him, all the time. But it was kind of neat. He started crying, and he was, really pouring out his heart and things. And then the man, he turned to me and he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm going down to a conference." And he said, "Oh, okay." And I remember how it came about, but I told him I'm just going to stay at the airport tonight, and I'll, get a cab over there tomorrow, or, take a bus or whatever. He said, "Well, come stay with us." Oh, at 19, okay. Yes, I got in a car with this guy, drove to his house, he and his wife and his daughter, really lovely people, Baptist people. They put me up in their guest room, which was really nice, fed me a big breakfast, drove me to the conference the next day, picked me up, had me over to dinner that week, took me to church, their Southern Baptist church, where the pastor yelled at me the whole time because I was a Pentecostal, and we had a great discussion. Afterwards, we ate watermelon. It was just wonderful. But, it's amazing how God provides. It's amazing how God provides. It just seems like these things happen to us at different junctures in our life. I didn't know what I was doing. I was 19, I was full of energy. I really had no fear. For all I know, something horrible could have happened down there. But God kind of orchestrated in such a way where He kind of saw me through. And I ended up being friends with that family for years and years, pen pals with them and things all through my Bible college and things like that. Just wonderful people. And I know I'm going to someday see them in glory and thank them again for their hospitality and for being an instrument of God's provision. We are all instruments of God's provision. And the truth of the matter is, part of being a Christ follower that very few Christians really grasp is the idea of God's providence in their lives. There's a lot of times where we have a need and we just kind of put up with it. And we just kind of feel like we deserve it. When in reality, God may actually have a miracle for us, or He may have something He wants to do in our lives that somehow meets that need. There's things people carry around, guilt and unforgiveness and sometimes need and all those kind of things. As a pastor, I've found out that there's different kinds of people. There are some people who whenever they have a need, they tell everybody. And then there's other people, when they have a need, they don't tell anybody. And I find that one of the joys as a pastor is finding those people that don't tell anybody and helping meet that need. I do that at Christmas a lot of times, and I pass on some of the gifts, the gift cards you guys give, but you have a need as a follower of Christ to provide for other people and to be part of that provision. You also have a need to be provided for. Did you know that? You know, if you're constantly giving, I want you to know God wants to give to you too. He wants to build you up. He wants to encourage you. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today and talk about one of the hardest passages in the Bible. It's found in Genesis. And I'll give you a little background. Abraham was called by God out of his home. And he traveled there with his wife of 90 years old, who was barren. She never had any children. And so he was an old man. And they traveled to the land of Canaan. God made a promise that you will have a child, and you're going to be a father of a great nation, and outnumber the sands of the seashore, and just that you're going to be responsible for this enormous nation, and that the child you would have would come through Sarah, who at that point was a senior citizen, right? And so, you know, there's a number of times through the story, and Abraham's kind of walk through this process and the struggles he went through is a really fascinating thing. So one of the things that happened at one point is Sarah heard that she was going to give birth, and she laughed like yeah, right, that ship has sailed. You know, I'm not having any children, and but God said He promised it. But at one point they got uncomfortable, or they got impatient, and Sarah, as was often the custom in those days, had a servant girl, and so she gave her servant girl to her husband to father a child. So he fathered a son named Ishmael. And Ishmael was kind of growing up and then Sarah got pregnant, and Sarah had a baby named Isaac. And so they kind of threw this party for Isaac and this baby, and Sarah looked over, and Ishmael was kind of mocking Isaac. And Sarah, being a protective mother, said to Abraham, get rid of her and that child. And here was Abraham. I mean, you're talking about feeling caught between. The real reason that they had this other child was because of their lack of faith, and also Sarah was the one who instigated this, yet now Sarah didn't want this responsibility. And so God, you know, Abraham was very upset, and God said, no, it's okay, send her away. I'm going to take care of her. I'm going to provide for her. And so God, it's an interesting story. Hagar was her name. She took her son Ishmael into the wilderness with some food and water, and they ran out of food and water, and she was discouraged, so she put Hagar under a tree, or Ishmael under a tree, went about a bow shot away, probably about 100 yards, and sat down. She said, I can't hear him die. And God spoke to her, and she went, and there was a spring came up, and water was provided, and the child survived and grew up and thrived and became the father of the Arab nations that we know today. It's ironic, eh? The Middle East, two people that can't seem to get along, Jews and Arabs, had the same father. But anyways, I digress. So here's Abraham, he sent his son away. So now he has one son, Isaac, and Isaac is the son of the promise. And so boys starting to grow up. We don't know whether he's 10, 11, 12 at this point, or a little older. And then we will pick up where God talks to him in chapter 22. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain I will show you. Early in the morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up, saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. And as the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there, and he arranged the wood on it. He then bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. Next slide. The angel of the Lord called out to Abraham from heaven a second time, and he said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you've done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all the nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba. And Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Tough passage, really is. Critics of the Bible would point to this passage and say, see? God's asking him to sacrifice his son. It's very barbaric. And they wouldn't be wrong. The nations that surrounded Abraham at the time and for many hundred years later, the most detestable of them had religions where you sacrificed your children. Molech, just a horrible situation. They'd have an idol beside a fire pit, and this thing would have arms extended. People would lay their babies on, and then at a point the lever would drop and drop the children into the pit. Horrible things. Asherah poles. You would turn your children over to the priests to become sexual slaves. And just horrible things were done in that time. And God hated these practices. He just hated them. And a number of times it's instructed his followers and his kings to wipe them out. Completely wipe out these religions. Do away with them. And so it seems like a contradiction. Here Abraham is asking, or God is asking Abraham, who he has promised through Isaac to birth a great nation, and is asking him to sacrifice him. And so this looks really hard, and it really is. Can you imagine Abraham's feelings when he's being asked this? Abraham at times showed a lack of faith before this time. There's a number of times he went to visit someone, his wife Sarah, although she was older, was very beautiful. And a number of times Abraham pretended to be her brother so that someone wouldn't kill him in order to take her as his wife. And so a number of times this happened, twice actually, and both times Abraham showed that self-preservation with him was a little more important than his faith, and at times he had to learn. There were other times God spoke to him, and Abraham believed God. And as a matter of fact, it says in the Bible that God credited it to him as righteousness. He saw Abraham as pure because of his belief, faith in that. And so here you have, and you've got to feel that what Abraham's feeling. He's waited this long. He's had this miracle baby, and now he's a little boy, and God is asking him to give him back. What a tough process. You imagine traveling for 2 days with Isaac, talking to him, hugging and kissing him, tucking him in at night, taking your little boy somewhere where God has told you that he will be taken from you. Imagine getting to the mountain and talking to the servants and saying, you stay here, and taking the young boy, loading the wood on his back, having him carried up that mountain, and then have the young boy go to him and say, Dad, where's the sacrifice? And Abraham saying to him, well, God will provide the sacrifice. Getting to that place and building that altar, putting the rocks together and building them up, placing the wood on it, and then binding his boy. And we don't know whether he was 11 or 21, but he's binding him up and laying him down and grabbing the knife in order to sacrifice his son. Barbaric indeed. And so the question is, why would God do this? Well, I've been agonizing over this passage with 3 or 4 groups of people. We talked about it in my small group. We did our ministry and men team. We went through this passage. I went through it with some other pastors and things like that because I really wanted to get my heart and my mind around this passage. And I've come to believe this. This passage is essential. This passage is important. And in a way, we need this passage for a couple of reasons, and I'm going to explain them in a minute. But just a couple of things. One, Abraham's faith. Abraham seems to know God well enough that he believes that God is going to intervene. And I'll tell you a couple of things. First one is this. is when he says to his servants to stay there, and when he's going to go up the mountain, he says, Isaac and I will return. So for whatever reason, he had a belief that the two of them would survive this experience. The second thing is when he's walking up with Isaac, I don't think he was speaking flippantly when he said, God will provide a lamb. Because he knew the nature of God and the God he trusted. But he was going to trust him to the end. Maybe he believed God was going to raise Isaac from the dead. Maybe he believed God was going to intervene. But you see this seed of faith in him where he knows the nature of God and where he has this ability, but he is following through on what God has asked him to do. And so I've got 3 little takeaways here. I'll walk you through them and then we'll provide some time for some Q&A. The first one is this, is the idea of giving everything to God. What does it mean, the meaning of God first? It's really funny. We're going to do a series coming up in the next few weeks called Hot Potatoes. And in there, Cheryl's going to be speaking about boundaries. I'm going to be talking about some things that in our society are very controversial. And they're topics that I've had many talks with people about. Not arguments. I don't like arguing with people, but just talks with people who have chosen sometimes ideas and morality that I don't believe is biblical. And as we're walking through that with these people and we're talking about these things, I've learned something through that process, which is for me absolutely essential when you're talking to people about Jesus. I don't ever set out to change somebody's mind about their morality a whole lot, but what I do is this: I talk to them about what it means to be a Christ follower. You see, a Christ follower puts Jesus at the top of their priorities. Okay? And so the things that are important to us, things that we may use to identify ourselves with, whether it's our profession or social status or our gender or, things that we hang on to. The question for a Christ follower is always this: are you willing to put everything on the altar and say, if I love God enough, do I love him enough to give this one thing up and trust him if you ask me to? And that can include everything. What is it? We all have different things that kind of own our hearts. Sometimes it's our kids. Sometimes it's our vehicle. Sometimes it's alcohol or drugs. We all have different things. We're all wired with some strengths and some weaknesses. And often in our weak spots, there's a brokenness there. And in that brokenness, there's this fear of what would ever happen if you lost that. What would ever happen if that was taken away? And God asks us often right at the front, it says, do you trust me? Are you willing to take that thing? Are you willing to walk away from it and follow me? Are you willing to walk away from it and live for me? And that's called living by faith. I remember as a kid I grew up with, he was a few years older than me. He was one of my friends growing up. He was sometimes not a good friend, but he was kind of who I hung out with. And he bought his dream car when he was 19. It was a 1967 blue Mustang 2-door. And we were both Jesus freaks, in our own way. And I remember asking him one day, I wasn't trying to be difficult or anything. I said, would you give up this car for God? He said, no, Scott. God would never ask me to give up this car. He wants me to be happy. And I remember just listening to him thinking, that somehow doesn't sound right. That a car is that important to someone, right? But I have my own things I hang on to. And you may too. And the question of a Christ follower is always, do you love me enough that you're willing to place this in God's hands? Your future, your family, your spouse, your vices, your challenges, your education, your dreams, all these kinds of things. You say, well, that's really mean. God's just taking away all my good stuff. No. God has something much better. He has something much better. And you know what I've found about God? A lot of times when we give these things over to him, there comes a time when he gives us something richer. And we find out that sometimes those weaknesses that we turn over to him become strengths. And God makes us strong in the broken places. And we end up helping tons of people through some of their struggles because of the struggles we've had. I remember when we first started the church, I did a series on marriage. And at that time, we had an enormous number of people in our congregation who had gone through a divorce. And I just felt so guilty. Here I was talking about how to make a marriage survive when, like 3/4 of us, congregation had gone through a divorce. And I just felt horrible. I remember talking to Joan Heeg at the time. She was one of the ladies with us who's married had come apart. And I said, I just feel so guilty talking about this because there's so many failed marriages here and things. And she said, no, teach it. She said, I wish someone had taught it back when we were struggling. If someone had said the things you're saying now, back when we began to unravel in our marriage, we might have saved it. No, you tell the truth. We need to hear it. I thought, wow, that's noble. That's really noble. Where she was just open that way to me. And so, what is the meaning of God first? The second thing is the idea of faith and foreshadowing. Faith and foreshadowing. You don't know the impact, the little decisions you make in obedience to God, the impact they're going to have on the future. You don't know. This passage, one of the things I love about it is when the angel comes back a second time to talk to him. It's like, first of all, he's about to sacrifice Isaac, and then God says, Abraham, Abraham. Okay? I want you to understand in the original language and all the nuances in there, God freaked out. Like he quite literally, don't do this. Okay? This wasn't a, hey, Abraham, by the way, just hold that knife there, will you? He was like, it was like God couldn't wait to say it. It's like he knew Abraham had to come to that point, but his lack of restraint comes through his words. As he speaks to Abraham, for whatever reason, God needed Abraham to be willing to give Isaac back to God. And so he does. And then the second thing, and again, you got to understand, this is all in block caps, okay? God says, the fact you did this, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to this nation and all this kind of stuff. And he says, all the nations of the world will be blessed through you. Someday, everybody is going to be blessed through you because of the decision you made today. In Abraham's little world, it's just him and his son. He had to be going, I don't know what I'm going to tell Sarah. I'm going to know what. He was a powerful man. But to him, it may not seem like much of the world cared about his little corner of it. And yet this one decision, you're here today because of that decision. Interesting. Abraham willing to turn everything over to God has impacted us this day because all the nations would be blessed through him. Israel would be the carriers of the Messiah, Jesus. And ever since Jesus, God has broken out into the whole world. It's been an amazing, amazing thing. And tens of millions and millions and millions of people have met God, all based on this decision. I'm digging deep in my memory of some of these things, but I heard the account once of someone who was in a bookstore, and there was a young boy in the back who was stocking shelves with shoes. No, it wasn't a bookstore, it was a shoe store. And he went back to the young man and he shared a bit of Christ, and he said, I'm going to a tent meeting tonight. I'm going to this big rally and stuff, and I'd like you to come with me. And so the young man went, and he gave his heart to Christ, and he served him. That man, when he went back to that shoe store and talked to the young man, didn't realize that that young man was going to be Billy Graham. Somebody decided to go back into a shoe store and invite a young man to experience something where he would meet God. And how many people did Billy Graham preach to? It was like almost 1 billion people reached because someone decided to go back in a shoe store. You don't know the little steps of faith you take, the impact they will have in this world. Those little steps of obedience. It's really ironic because it's often things that we know we should do, right? But it's just hard. It's hard sometimes to put God first. It's hard to give him everything, isn't it? It really is. That's why Jesus made it something that we do daily. He said, every day, take up your cross and follow me. But you don't know. You don't know that kind word you're going to share to someone, or that volunteering you do, or that gift you give someone, or those groceries, or that young person you're going to invite to church, or you don't know what's going to happen with that. You might just change the world and not even realize you're doing it. So that's the second part. And the third part is this is a foreshadow to the connection to Easter. I don't know if this passage would make sense to me aside from Easter. You see, God's first words to Abraham is, take your son, your only son, whom you love. Okay? God's not mincing any words. He knows how much Isaac means to Abraham. Abraham has given up everything and brought this little life into the world, that this child was a representation of the promise of God. He was precious to him. He was his only son. He meant everything. And so God knows how much Isaac means to Abraham. And so he says to Abraham, he says, take your son, your only son whom you love. 3,000 years later, Jesus would be baptized by his cousin John the Baptist. And as he came out of the water, a voice from heaven spoke, this is my only son whom I love. God knew ahead of time what Abraham felt for Isaac, because someday God was going to send his own son up a hill. And this time, the axe would fall for sure. You see, there's something about Abraham. The birth of this nation is founded at this kind of linchpin where Abraham's willing to give Isaac. He's willing to give everything to serve God, because there's going to come a time when God is going to give everything to save us. The Easter connection here cannot be underappreciated. There's so many parallels. And if you have any doubt about that, when he's talking about all the nations will be blessed through you, he's talking about the Messiah. No Jew would read that passage without knowing what he was talking about is the coming Messiah. This was all foreshadowed. Aside from Easter, I would struggle a lot more with this passage because it just seems mean and cruel, and it's like God's playing mind games with him, when in reality, God is foreshadowing something. He put Abraham through something that he knew Abraham would act up to. And he put him through something in order to show the world of what he was going to do. Ravi Zacharias, I love his teaching. He's a really smart guy, and he's even smarter than me, and he's much smarter than me. He's got a neat story. Have you ever, on YouTube, look up Ravi Zacharias, some of his messages. I mean, if you can't hear one of his messages and get excited, there's something seriously wrong with you, because that man is just an incredible witness. And he goes all over to universities and colleges and is involved with sharing God to atheists and all kinds of people. And one of the things he was invited to is the Archbishop of Canterbury was invited to Palestine to meet with some of the leaders and founders of Hamas. And there was one guy, I think his name was Tigal Shek, and they were meeting with them, and each one of the delegation was allowed to ask the Palestinians one question, or the leadership one question. And so Ravi Zacharias asked his question, and the man responded, and Ravi said, I don't like your answer. But he said, I want to tell you something. He said, 5,000 years ago, not far from here, Abraham took his son, and you believe it's Ishmael, we believe it's Isaac. I'm not going to debate that with you. He took his son up a hill and was willing to sacrifice him. And God intervened and provided at that point. And God indicated that God will provide. And Shek bobbed his head, yeah, absolutely. And the rabbi said, 2,000 years ago, God sent his own son up that hill. And this time he didn't hold the axe back. And his son died so that if we accept him, then we will stop sending our own sons to die. This man had a number of sons who had gone as suicide bombers, and he had another son in prison and Ravi said, he died so that we don't have to send our sons to war anymore. And Ravi said there was just this like peace, kind of settled through the room, and they were leaving, and he wondered if he kind of blown it. He wondered if he had done something wrong, but he felt a peace about it. And the man came afterwards and was saying goodbye to them, and he came up to Ravi, grabbed him, and kissed him on both cheeks, patted his head, and he said, "You are a good man. I'd like to see you again." And whatever it was, it kind of got through to him. So when we look at Abraham, we look at this account, remember that God was going to do this for us. And that's not insignificant. And so whenever I read this passage now, I look at it with new eyes. This is the first time I've ever preached it. Sometimes it's one of these passages like you kind of avoid because you think, how am I going to convey that? But I got to be honest with you. I'm at a point now where I can't see the scriptures without it. I'm glad it's there. Because as tough as it is, it reveals to me the reality of a God who gave everything for me. And as I walk with Abraham up that mountain with his son who he loves, the question goes, is this what God felt to give his son? And if he did, how much did he love me in order to do that? That's all I got to say about that. So we got a couple minutes for questions. Who's got the mic? John, you got the mic? It's turned on? Okay. Questions or comments? I went through it nice and fast so that we got time for questions or comments. So if you want to text a question too, you can text it to my phone if you're feeling a little shy. Thanks, Dougie.
You can always count on me, Scott.
Yeah.
So, actually, the phrase that I just love in that passage is the phrase, early the next morning. And it reminds me of another phrase with Jesus when he was a baby. And after the Magi had gone, I'm just reading from Matthew. An angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt. And just, these great moments where men of faith hear from God.
Yeah.
They didn't, Abraham didn't kind of go, well, I got to talk this over with my wife. I got to pray about it. I got to... Early the next morning.
Yeah.
The hardest thing he could ever have been asked to do. He didn't procrastinate. He didn't wait.
Yeah.
He knew he'd heard from God,
Yeah.
and so he did it right away.
Yeah.
And I'm always so humbled by that, right? Because sometimes we know we've heard from God, but we still have to have this confirmation and that confirmation.
Mm.
And sometimes, if Joseph hadn't acted right away, I probably would have been killed prematurely.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's just something that always strikes me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just when you hear from God, don't
Act on.
wait around.
Yeah.
Act right away.
Yeah.
And then just the other scripture that comes up for me that relates to one of your points, I think it's from Psalm 37. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart.
Yeah.
So a lot of times when we're giving something up for God, we will actually get something that we value far more
Yes.
than what we have given up.
Yeah. 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 Thank you, Doug. A lot of wisdom in that. Trish?
I have two questions on. I don't know if you're going to be able to answer them. They're quite, I don't know. I'm
That's right. I'll
sitting
just
here
ask Jane. She knows
trying to
everything.
phrase a question, and it makes me think about how important it is to ask the right question about everything in life. But anyway, this, first of all, I want to know, when was the first time in history that the ultimate sacrifice became the sacrifice of a child? And the second question is, how do we know when we hear God's voice to give the ultimate sacrifice, and tell us what that is? And I know they're really complicated.
Those are two, yeah. No, those are good questions, Trish. There's
also the land and how that's supposed to be seen.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. God will provide a lamb, right? And we're talking about God's provision today. The idea of child sacrifice seems to be as old as man, like dating right back to the beginning. Some of the people that we hear about in the early chapters of Genesis are actually believed to be fathers of some of the religions that were going to use child sacrifice as part of them. One comes to mind, a man named Nimrod, a number of others. These people are attributed as the people that started. So it seems as long as mankind's been around, or humankind, if you're Pierre Trudeau, or Justin Trudeau, as long as we've been around, people have been sacrificing their children, and we still do. We still do.
How did they know to do that? What voice did they hear? Who told them to do it?
Well, I think there's an impulse in, like right now, we've just had, I'm sorry, a little bit of soapbox, we've just had a government that authorized, the use of a narcotic with it. And there's lots of arguments on both sides. I'm not going to pick a side or anything like that on that, but it just seems like a lot of the things right now that our governments are behind show poor moral standing. The government's become our bookies, our drug dealers, have become our creditors, they've become our bartenders. Government is so involved in those things, when in reality government at the same time is getting up and saying, we understand morality, and you don't have to go to church. We'll tell you what's right and wrong, and those kind of things. Just a little soapbox I got. Well, we sacrifice our generations, our young people, because it's our young people that end up paying the price for our poor decisions, And so, yeah, that's just, by the time these kids, a lot of them graduate from college, university, there's such an enormous debt, particularly in the States. You can't declare bankruptcy and get out of your student debt. You never will. And so some of those kids will never recover. Some of them owe hundreds of thousands of dollars, from a system that, they borrowed money, and you say, well, they shouldn't borrow money, or they should work harder or whatever, but, they're young, right? I don't know if you remember being young. I remember being young. I wasn't always thinking long term, right? It's all these kind of things where people are sacrificing their children. So as old as people have been around, we've been sacrificing our children. The second thing is, how do I know it's God? I could do a whole week on hearing God's voice, and I will again, because every couple of weeks a couple of years I pull that message out, okay? But I'm going to just briefly give you some Coles notes on how to help. You have to practice the presence of God so that you become familiar with His voice. Okay? And you do that through reading Scripture, coming to church and hearing His Word taught, being in a small group and interacting about the Scriptures, praying, being quiet before God and listening to the subtlety of His voice, being around other followers of Christ, have been followers for a long time, and hear the wisdom of the things they've learned from, even their mistakes. I always say life's too short not to learn from other people's mistakes, And you practice the presence of God, and then when it happens, when He speaks to you, you recognize it because it falls in line with all those other things. It just kind of happens. And I can tell you, as someone at times who's tried to run away from God, I've had my own Jonah experiences. He talks. When I remember one point, I got married, and after I've got my minister's degree and all that, and life was good. I got a job. Life's going great, and all those kind of things. And I was volunteering in my church, serving God, and I was doing well and making money, and married and happy, and all those kind of things. I remember one morning I got on the 115. I used to go around Television Road because it was much quicker than going through the city. And I was just coming on the 115, and then I heard a voice. Scott, get ready, you're going into the ministry. I hadn't heard from God for like 6 years before that. I was like, oh, hey, now you talk to me, you know, kind of thing. Because I'd been going through a lot of angst during that time. Maybe I'll never be a pastor. I thought I was called. Am I called? Maybe I'm called to be something else. Maybe I'll, go to this. Maybe I'll do that. I try all kinds of different professions and all that. I had a lot of self-doubt. And then God says, it's time. And within 9 months, I was in the ministry. I was doing that full time. It's practicing God's presence so that when he talks, you know. And listen, when he talks to you, it's not wrong to go to other people and say, this is what I'm hearing from the Lord. You can bear witness to this, all those kind of things. Because God often, a lot of times, will surround you with people that affirm that. Once in a while, in a rare occurrence, God is talking to you, and the people around you will say, well, that can't be God. Okay, it does happen. When I planted this church, went through some real bumpy times for a while, and I remember people going, Scott, I just don't know if it's going to happen. But I knew I'd heard from God. And so I stuck with it. And God told me to stick with it. And we're here as a result. Okay? And so it's practicing the presence of God. That's how you learn to hear his voice. And then when he talks, you know. David. Don't get comfortable, John.
Just to follow up on how do you know it's God's voice? God will never ask you to do anything that doesn't agree with his scripture. He will ask you things to do that does agree with his scripture. And over the years, unlike Scott, I've never heard God's audible voice, but he sure impresses his will on me every once in a while.
Yeah.
And there's been times when he's asked us to do some things that were a stretch for us.
Yeah.
And when we did those things, later on it was confirmed that was his voice. Sometimes we've helped people out financially, and we've had some feedback about they were in desperate straits that we didn't know about that at all. There's been some other times when we followed God's lead, and we've never got any feedback. But you feel good inside that you have done something. Remember one time being in Loblaws, being in line, there were 2 students, female students ahead of us, probably in their late teens, went to pay for their groceries. Their credit card wouldn't work. Their debit card wouldn't work. They were really, really embarrassed, and they didn't know what to do, and they were trying to sort out, do I take some things away, and how much change have you got, and whatever. And I really felt God at that time speaking to me and said, pay their bill. So I told the cashier, I said, just put it on my bill. And anyway, long story short is, I never got any feedback from that at all. But I felt good about doing that. And so sometimes when we step into other people's lives and do the things that, if they were poor at that time. So you step into their lives and you do what God has asked you to do. It agrees with Scripture. And the more you do it, the more you practice that, the more you'll hear God's voice.
More familiar. That's good, Dave.
I just want to add to that too. I think
just wait for the mic. We're on YouTube right now.
Listening to the two of you really helped. And I think, first of all, what you were saying about governments and voices. So I think there's so much noise pollution around us. I think it's harder and harder to hear God's voice because there's just more noise pollution from all different sources, and you're not sure which voice to listen to. So there's governments, and then there's social media, and then there's TV news. People, when I was on the SkyTrain on their phones, talking to people in a very mean and harsh way, and it's like, oh my gosh, it's everywhere.
Everybody's shouting.
So I think meditation, and there's different. I have 4 sons, and some of them believe in meditation, which is I think quietness is important, and to take that quiet time and then really try to hear. I think we don't do that enough, and I think I will be thinking about doing that more after listening to both of you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Trish. You're welcome. It's just, you know what they call that? Data smog. Just wherever, and today everybody's mad, right? Like you notice, like everybody's shouting over each other about things, and it's just it's a time where, as a Christ follower, I think we need to be the voice of calm and reason, you know, peacemakers in our time. We really do, yeah. One more, Brad. It's nice to have you home, Ryan, Megan. Reading break? Yeah? That's awesome. Did you get some candy? Not yet. It's going to happen. Because Cheryl really needs you guys to sugar up. Yeah. Go ahead.
I really like Romans 12 and verse 1. In light of God's mercy, offer yourselves as living sacrifices. And, you know, back when Abraham was being asked to do this, it was in the context where we sacrifice so that we get mercy, and that was the pattern. But now, because we're on the other side of the ultimate sacrifice, Christ's death, we don't sacrifice anymore in the same way to get mercy. And sometimes I think when God asks us to do things, sometimes I have had conversations with people where it sounds like they're thinking, oh, I have to do this, or God's going to be angry at me, or I have to do this, or, you know, I might not be a Christian, that kind of thing. Yeah. From this sort of Old Testament perspective that we sacrifice in order to get mercy. But Paul was saying in Romans, because the sacrifice of Christ has already happened, in light of God's mercy that's already availed, let's then reverse it and offer ourselves as living sacrifices. And so when God asks us to do things, we do it from a place of safety and security and salvation and joy and peace and favor. And so it's not motivated out of fear, it's motivated of, hey, I think God's asking me to do something, and I want to, out of thanksgiving, to respond.
Do you know, one of my biggest challenges as a pastor is getting people to understand that. You know, we live in a world so much that we're trying to be good to deserve God's grace. By the way, the basket people, if you want to make your way around the innies and outies and those kind of things for offering. One of the scriptures I love, my wife quotes to me from time to time because it's one of her favorites. It is your kindness that leads us to repentance. You know, why am I willing to lay everything at Jesus' feet? Because I love him. I love him. When I learned what he did for me, God's grace and the audacity of it is, wow. You know, you've heard me talk about the three things I can't believe. You know, the first is that God died for my sins. He didn't have to. I should have paid the price for it, but he did. But then he has the audacity beyond that to say, not only I died for your sins, I will adopt you as my children. So I actually become a son of God, you know, a child of God in light of his, you know, what he's done for me. And so he adopts me, you know, and says I'm going to spend eternity with him. I mean, that's audacious. And the third audaciousness is he actually rewards me for stuff I should have done in the first place. So he rewards you on top of that. God is not like us. I'll tell you, he's not like us. It is amazing what he does. If he did that for me, giving myself, my complete self, wow, that's my mind, a no-brainer. But so many people, you know, they're trying to work their way to heaven. They're trying to, you know, earn it. They're trying to make God happy with them, you know, and not realizing that there's nothing you can do to make God love you more, and there's nothing you can do to make God love you less. He loves you. He cares for you. And, absorbing that is often the path to righteousness. It really is. You become a much better person the closer you get to God. It really is. George Whitefield used to preach. He used to say, earn our way to heaven? Ha! I'd sooner try to climb to the moon on a rope of sand. You know, and he's not wrong. You've been very patient. You know, I love the Q&A because I love to hear your feedback and your questions and all those kind of things. And I don't think anybody texted anything in. Nope, no text today. Oh, John.
Just to clarify, fruit cups are not candy.
What's that?
Fruit cups are not candy.
You're right. You're right.
There's some over on the table. That's just not right.
Whoever brought those, you should be ashamed of yourself. Who won the card, Michael? Oh, there she goes. That's great. You must be hoarding these, eh? No? You just drink it all, right? No, I know. You often give them back. Next week, we start hot potatoes. And next week, we're going to talk about the opiate crisis. And I want you to pray for me, because these are things I just study my brains out for and then try to give intelligent responses. And I've got to got my feet in two worlds when I'm talking about these things. I'm trying to understand our present age, and I'm trying to understand what God speaks to our present age. And so next week, we're going to talk about that topic because it's one very relevant in our society. It's very nice to have Peter and Judy. I know you guys hate me pointing you out, but we've really missed you. It's nice to have you back. These two have been taking care of their parents. And so a lot of Sundays, they're caring for people and that. But they really miss you guys, and we really miss them. And so it's so nice to have you back. Visit lots, okay? And come back and be with us because we miss you guys. God bless you. Thanks for being with us. Can you do me a favor? Grab another thing of candy on the way out the door, because otherwise I bring it home and you are not going to like what happens if I eat all that candy. All right? God bless you. Thanks for being with us.
Your love is stronger. And so then the speaker was coming off the stand, and I was like, there's no point leaving the music on if the projector's off and the speaker...